Hello and thank you for joining me. I'm going to be walking you through setting up FusionAuth in about 5 minutes. There are a couple of prerequisites. You need to make sure you have a database installed, and you need to make sure that you have Node.js installed. I'm going to use Postgres and version 14 of Node, but you should be fine with any of the databases supported by FusionAuth, which you can see on the FusionAuth website, and pretty much any recent version of Node should work just fine. So the first thing we need to do when we are setting up FusionAuth is to actually get the FusionAuth executable. And we strongly encourage you to read this install script. This is going to download a zip file and install it in the current directory, and that will basically be pretty much everything aside from the database that FusionAuth needs to run. So you can see it gives us a couple of other instructions. We can start up FusionAuth. There you go, I got to be in the right directory. And then from there, we can go ahead and visit FusionAuth. This takes us to maintenance mode, which asks us a few questions about how we want to configure this instance of FusionAuth. The most important one is the superuser credentials. These are used if you don't set up the database previously. So FusionAuth will take care of setting up the database. And then we also have the FusionAuth credentials. If you want to set the username and the password to something non-standard, you can go ahead and modify these. That password is a randomly generated string. All right, and then just last thing, make sure that you're pointing to the correct database type and location of your database. So FusionAuth is now configuring. So FusionAuth is successfully installed, and now we're going to create the initial admin account. You need to make sure you accept the license and optionally sign up for the newsletter. The next thing you want to do to get an application up and running in FusionAuth is to create an application. So you can see that FusionAuth itself is an application within FusionAuth. And as a reminder, an application is anything you can sign into. You need to make sure that the authorization code grant is enabled here. And we're going to need to add in a redirect URL. This is going to be different for every application, but for this sample application, we're going to be redirecting back to localhost. Make sure we add that. And that's all the configuration we need to do right now. All right. Then one other thing we need to do is users need to be associated with an application. And in FusionAuth, that's called a registration. So we can see this user that we just created, this admin user. So we're going to add them to this new application. They could have a username, languages, time zone, but we're not going to set up any of that. just going to use the default values. So that is pretty much all we need to do from the FusionAuth side. The next thing we need to do is actually set up the application that corresponds to the 5-minute setup guide FusionAuth application. And the easiest way to do that is to clone a Node.js repository. So I just open a new tab, going to clone this repository. We need to install the required npm packages. Then we need to go ahead and modify a couple of files to make sure that they correspond to the application that we just created in FusionAuth. So we scroll down to the OAuth information, grab the client ID and client secret. And we are done. We can start up the server, log out of our current session with FusionAuth, and go to the port the Node application is running on. And there we are. That hello Dan is pulled from the FusionAuth data. You can, if you want, go ahead and take a deeper look at that code and see how all the pieces fit together. But that was setting things up in, I think it might have taken a little more than 5 minutes, approximately 5 minutes, to go from not having anything except for a database in Node to a fully functioning FusionAuth installation with a sample application integrated using the authorization code grant.